as a result of a particular request. And this has to do with something we're asking that everybody be involved in, not just in this assembly, but anybody who is watching what we are doing. There's an article up on our website called Bill Binney and Larry Johnson Shred Robert Mueller's Russian Hack Fable. This is not the earlier deployment that we have done around this matter. This is something much different. We are going to just indicate this because everybody here should go to our website and pick this article up and send it out immediately to everyone you know. But it's also being done so that people that hear this webcast or see this webcast will do the same. So this was written by Barbara Boyd, and it begins, Bill Binney, the former technical director of the NSA, and Larry Johnson, formerly of the Central Intelligence Agency, wrote the article reprinted below on our site. In a sane nation, it would have been published widely in prominent media, discussed and debated. Binney and Johnson would have been immediately contacted by Special Counsel Mueller because what they have written destroys the entire narrative of Russian cyber war to swing the 2016 election to Donald Trump. Congress would be beating down their doors to learn more. In a sane nation, people would be pursuing truth based on scientific proofs. This is not the nation of the present. In our view, to reassert its sanity, the nation must now demand that Robert Mueller refute, beyond a reasonable doubt, what is presented by Binney and Johnson. That is the resounding demand which must meet the specious fake report he is about to present to the Attorney General. Now Binney has examined the metadata of the actual DNC files published by WikiLeaks and demonstrated that they are also consistent with transfer to a thumb drive or a storage device rather than a Russian internet-based hack. Although this story has received some attention, as on the Gateway Pundit and Zero Hedge, it must receive the broadest possible circulation. Now then what we do is we have, or in the side of Binney and Johnson's article, are 4 paragraphs that thoroughly destroy the entire Mueller premise. This is important because this had not been done in this way before. These paragraphs, if made available to the American people, would change day-to-day life in the United States in an immediate fashion. So I'm going to reference them, not go through them entirely, but just reference them so that those who are watching this, when they go to the article that is, for which the remarks I just read are an introduction, will pick up on these paragraphs. And they say, according to a DOJ press release on the indictment of the Russians, Mueller declares that the emails were obtained via a spear phishing attack. Spear phishing just means that remotely hacked, as you've all heard. And they go through the indictment, they reference it, they quote it. I'm not going to do that. Then, notwithstanding the DOJ press release, an examination of the WikiLeaks DNC files does not support the claim that the emails were obtained via spear phishing. Instead, the evidence clearly shows that the emails posted on the WikiLeaks site were copied onto an electronic media, such as a CD-ROM or thumb drive, before they were posted at WikiLeaks. The emails posted on WikiLeaks were saved using the File Allocation Table, also known as FAT, Computer File System Architecture. An examination of the WikiLeaks DNC files shows that they were created on the 23rd, 25th, and 26th of May, respectively. The fact that they appear in a FAT system format indicates the data was transferred to a storage device, such as a thumb drive. How do we know? Now, this is important because this is no longer a matter of opinion of anybody. How do we know? The truth lies in the last modified timestamps on the WikiLeaks files. Every single one of these timestamps ends in even numbers. If you are not familiar with the FAT file system, you need to understand that when a date is stored under this system, the data rounds the time to the nearest even numbered second. We have examined 500 DNC email files stored on WikiLeaks, and all 500 files end in an even number, 2, 4, 6, 8, or 0. If this system other than FAT had been used, there would have been an equal probability of the timestamp ending with an odd number. But this is not the case with the data stored on the WikiLeaks site. All end with an even number. The random probability that FAT was not used is 1 chance in 2 to the 500th power, or approximately 1 chance in 10 to the 150th power. In other words, an infinitely high order. Just so people understand that, 10 to the 6th is a million, 10 to the 9th is a billion, 10 to the 12th is a trillion, 10 to the 15th is a quadrillion, 10 to the 18th is a quintillion, okay? 10 to the 21st is a sextillion. So this is 10 to the 150th. This data alone does not prove that the emails were copied at the DNC headquarters, but it does show that the data emails posted by WikiLeaks did go through a storage device, like a thumb drive, before WikiLeaks posted the emails on the World Wide Web. This fact alone is enough to raise reasonable doubt about Mueller's indictment, accusing 12 Russian soldiers as the culprits for the leak of the DNC emails to WikiLeaks. A savvy defense attorney will argue, and rightly so, that someone copied the DNC files to a storage device and transferred that to WikiLeaks. Okay, so now those are the 4 paragraphs. And what we want to do and say here, and I think we'll be able to, through the magic of media, interpolate this section of what I just did to the top of what we presented today. We want people deploying on this. This will have an impact way beyond anything that you will imagine or could imagine. And this is not our imagination. This has nothing to do with any sort of political advocacy in the normal sense. This is something else. And it's important, I think, that people just understand that we are involved and have been requested to be involved in a very specific deployment on behalf of the American people and on behalf of the administration. And we have a role. That doesn't mean the administration is doing this. It means that we as Americans, we as citizens, are playing a role in bringing something to the American people that is irrefutable. And I say again, as we say, it doesn't mean we've proven who did anything. We've just proven that there is no possible way of proceeding with this set of claims by Mueller without reversing the reasonable doubt that is required by law. So that is not the situation that we have been in up to now. This is a different situation. We have a lot to do today, and we have a particular presentation which is intended to correct for the nefarious, if not treasonous, attempts by various media to deflect the American people from the most important question before them, a question that was being negotiated by the President of the United States in Hanoi earlier this week, the issue of war and peace. Before we get started into talking about that as such, let me just indicate that the Executive Intelligence Review magazine of this week, called Courage Will Change the Future, is a report on the first panel in particular of our February 16th conference. That conference held largely in memoriam to Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, who passed away on February 12th. But the motto, Courage Will Change the Future, is exactly fitting for our situation here today. While the President of the United States was involved in attempting to bring to an end a 60-plus-year-old conflict, 64-year-old conflict between the United States and North Korea, in tandem with efforts being made by Russia and Japan to bring an end to the hostilities of World War II, and others were also collaborating along with the nation of China in attempting to make a momentous and fundamental change in the world. Here in the United States, people were treated to the unholy and unruly spectacle of Michael Cohen's testimony. We're not going to discuss that. We're going to discuss the fact that the danger being posed to the American people by that kind of irresponsibility being shown by not merely the American media, but by the Congress of the United States as well, is a danger which has to be superseded. And our efforts at LaRouche PAC are directed toward that. We understand the nature of the actual discussion that was happening. And of course, we always try to make the point that it is British imperial policy which is the primary enemy of the United States. The very selection of the place of negotiation, Hanoi, holds a story that we won't tell in any detail right now, but let's just point out that it was the British who got the Americans involved in Vietnam, not the French. This occurred at the end of the war in 1945, and for peculiar reasons, as a result of a discussion that had happened at Potsdam involving not Roosevelt, who had died, but the new president, Harry Truman, it had been decided that British forces would accept the surrender of the Japanese in Southeast Asia, including in Saigon. And there was a dispute between the British and Douglas MacArthur because the British attempted to move their forces into Saigon to reinstate the French as a colonial dominant force there. MacArthur did not want that done until he had accepted the surrender of the Japanese on September 2nd. It was said afterwards that it was because of MacArthur's forcing the delay of the British occupation, essentially colonial reoccupation of Vietnam, that Ho Chi Minh was allowed to, and the Viet Minh forces were allowed to have weeks in which they were able to consolidate power. This is, of course, completely a lie. But it's relevant because it's also important to recognize that on September 2nd, 1945, when Douglas MacArthur was accepting the surrender of the Japanese, that Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh held a declaration of independence for the Republic of Vietnam, citing at the very beginning of that the Declaration of Independence of the United States. And that at the time of that ceremony, there were 2 American jets that flew overhead as an expression of solidarity to that. From that point, in 1945, after late September, the British reinstated, actually, the Japanese. They took Japanese prisoners of war and used them to patrol prior to the French being able to get there and begin to reoccupy. And then from no later than 1946, the conflict began. It's important to recognize, therefore, that it was not merely French colonialism at all, but it was the British opposition to the United States' role, not just in Southeast Asia, but in the post-war world, which is the dominant and primary theme of American life. That it was Truman's, well, I don't know if you call him his friend, but the Secretary of Treasury, John Wesley Snyder, who opposed everything that Roosevelt had put into, he was a secretary from Wall Street, we'll call him, who had opposed everything that Roosevelt had put into place through the New Deal, who actually had the final word on the firing of Douglas MacArthur during the Korean conflict. He was openly skeptical of the New Deal and of all of the social programs. And so what had happened was that these forces, Truman particularly, who were under the sway culturally and morally of the British, shaped a world that Donald Trump was beginning to attempt to end there in Hanoi, not just in the negotiations with the North Vietnamese, with the North Koreans, excuse me, but because of the way in which the entire process of negotiation and discussion had been put into motion, that presidents of nations negotiate these matters, and they do this on behalf of their people. That idea of the presidents of nations, such as Vladimir Putin of Russia, Xi Jinping of China, Donald Trump, Modi of India, that they are the negotiators and that you have a 4 powers agreement that's shaped by these personalities and by their representation of nations and nation states. This is antithetical to British policy, and it will be fought in every possible way. And what's happening is that in the United States right now, these forces are acting as a result of the fact that they have never been placed under control because the Mueller investigation has been allowed to go ahead. Now, we have to play a certain role in stopping this, and we have to understand why this is crucial. There have been many articles that we have published in the last period of time, including our expose of the group called Integrity International, which is a very specific British intelligence black propaganda operation that targets Russia, China, Western Europe, and the United States. This was something that just got exposed at the end of last year. It isn't our general or generic denunciation of British intelligence at all. It's a group which is run under the Institute for Statecraft, which is a British non-governmental organization, receiving 95% of its funding from the British government, from NATO, and the U.S. State Department. It's housed in London, right next to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and it is the institutional framework through which the present operations are being conducted against the presidency of the United States. So we're not talking even about Christopher Steele. We're not even talking about what we knew from 2015 and 2016. We're talking about something which is an ongoing policy being conducted by British intelligence against these powers right now. We're not even talking about the House of Lords report, which came out, of course, in December, which states that a second Trump administration is opposed to the interests, the foreign policy interests of the British government and British imperial forces as expressed by the House of Lords. So that is the battle that we are in, and that is the battle that is unfolding and was unfolding here in the United States. And the Cohen testimony was merely an obscene expression of that. But what's important is that our citizens find themselves being victimized by this attempt to deflect them from recognizing that there is an extraordinary danger, an actual danger of thermonuclear war, a continually advancing process of distrust, which can only be corrected if it is seen by the nations of China and Russia, and possibly also North Korea for that matter, that the President of the United States is, in fact, the President of the United States. He is, in fact, that person that actually runs and is able to control American policy against the coup made against the American presidency many, many years ago. Just want to say one final thing, that the concept of why the British hate the United States is crucially expressed in the form of the Green New Deal. But rather than say anything about the Green New Deal itself, let me simply point out that the war on the question of population and population increase between the burgeoning America and Great Britain is something that evolved during the period before there was even a United States. When Ben Franklin wrote his essay, Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind and the Peopling of Countries, an essay that was reprinted 10 times over the, it was written in 1751, and then was reprinted 10 times over a 15-year period going into the Revolution. That this was known or recognized as the document that expressed exactly what it was the British imperial forces opposed. It's a document that was first attacked by a Venetian by the name of Gian Maria Ortiz, but it was also cited by Malthus directly, Parson Thomas Malthus, in his essay on the principle of the population. It was also cited by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. And the point was that the idea that it was a good thing to increase at an increasing rate the human population became the actual, if you will, larger cultural or larger philosophical standpoint of contention between the United States, the young United States, or the American colonies, actually, that became the United States, and the British Empire. So that has been the issue, and that is the issue of the Green New Deal. As Ocasio-Cortez, or Occasional Cortex, as we sometimes call her, has said, maybe it's the case that people shouldn't have as many children. After all, if you believe that carbon dioxide is a pollutant, then you believe that every time that people breathe, they are polluting. And so the fundamental issue, which we took up, for example, at a recent intervention in Boston, where Henry Kissinger appeared a few days ago, and we knew that some students wanted to protest, and they were there to protest his population control policy, from 1974, the National Security Study Memorandum 200, we thought that was way too safe. It's very easy to talk about Kissinger and what he did wrong 45 years ago. But it was another thing to make the point, as we did, that Kissinger's NSSM 200 policy is the Green New Deal. So you can't protest Kissinger and not protest and not oppose the Green New Deal. That created a different kind of cognitive dissonance for those students. Because that it's easy to talk about something that happened a long time ago, that's not right in front of you, that's not popular or being popularized, and is not something that your friends in your dormitory support. Opposing fascist ideas or negative ideas or genocidal ideas is very simple when you don't have to confront the people in your dorm. What's needed now is that we have to confront people with the fact that things that they are either caused to believe or have allowed themselves to believe, or things that they don't believe but nonetheless are becoming hegemonic, have to be fought. You have to fight them with an actual idea of what to do. You can't be simply negative. You have to have the kind of proposals that we featured at our conference and we feature in terms of our idea about the strategic defense of the earth and many other things. But it is necessary to take on those forces that are fighting on behalf of a world that, if you allow them to succeed in overthrowing this presidency at this time, could result in nothing less than thermonuclear war in the short term. And that would be very bad for the planet. We don't think that should be something that should be allowed. So to try to give the context of that danger and what we have to do about it, I want to introduce Elliot Greenspan, who is a co-director of the Manhattan Project, to take us through that analysis.
Thank you, Dennis. At the Schiller Institute conference, which many of you were at 2 weeks ago, February 16, a dramatic intervention was made by the Russian government, the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, who put forward an approximation of the four powers concept proposed over decades by Lyndon LaRouche as the decisive initiative to stop the escalation to nuclear war. Listen to the beginning of the ambassador's message as it was delivered by the counselor from the Russian mission, Theodore Strizhevsky.
It's a real pleasure for me to be here, giving the tribute to the role which Russian-American relations play in modern world and the contribution of Schiller's Institute to that relations. We wrote a statement, we prepared a statement, which I will read now. First of all, I cordially welcome the organizers, participants, and guests of this conference. The Schiller Institute is known for its valuable contribution to the understanding of international political processes and development of new approaches to the global challenges. The conferences held under your auspices are respectful platforms where the most urgent present-day issues can be discussed without politicizing and ideological cliches. We were very saddened by the bitter news about the passing of Lyndon LaRouche, the founder and inspirer of the Schiller Institute. We would like to express our deepest condolences to Helga Zepp LaRouche, as well as to the relatives and colleagues. We are convinced that the paradigm of international political and economical interaction that he had proposed will be further developed by his apprentices and associates.
Nebenzia proceeded to warn in this message about the shattering of the world security architecture and counterposed the integration of the Eurasian Economic Union, led by Russia, and the Chinese One Belt, One Road. He emphasized the importance of the triangular process, Russia, China, India cooperation, and the urgency of the United States, of Russian-American relations coming into, shall we say, normalcy or progress. And as you see, that this is decisive for global stability. As you see here, this was put forward by the Russian government in the context of their recognition of the singular importance of the Schiller Institute, of Helga Zepp-LaRouche, and of Lyndon LaRouche. LaRouche PAC, several days ago, put it this way, and I'll quote. This was on the website. With his passing, Lyndon LaRouche has uncorked a process which is moving the world substantively toward a new strategic alliance of forces capable of establishing a new paradigm of physical economic development, peace, and cultural renaissance. End quote. Our power to accomplish this is rooted in LaRouche's singular power, the power of reason, as LaRouche calls his autobiography. The realm of ideas which actually shape history. In such an historic moment as this is uniquely decisive. So among others, the Russians recognize this. They are playing the LaRouche card. The campaign launched over the last weeks and intensified at the conference and since. The campaign for LaRouche's exoneration, for President Trump to act affirmatively for the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche from the injustice which jailed LaRouche and the related injustices at the hands of the same British, Mueller, and so on combination that we see with Trump today. That for Trump to act in such a way, for our movement to create the conditions for that to occur, is decisive in defeating the British imperial forces that hate Trump and have hated LaRouche for many, many years, thereby freeing the president to bring America at long last into the four powers, to consolidate the great future, the great potential to create a future through the new Bretton Woods. I want to concentrate this presentation on the strategic dimension of the unfolding crisis, in particular the existential danger of a third world war, as Dennis has referenced, a nuclear war of extinction. I want to focus your attention on this war danger, insofar as it's astonishing that such a danger appears not to exist. If you listen to the mass media, the mainstream media, if you listen to the Congress, if you listen to most citizens, perhaps it's too frightening to face. Perhaps more informed Americans fog out, thinking, I can't do anything about this, about war and peace. I am preoccupied by my day-to-day concerns, family, job, survival, pleasure, matters closer to home, matters within my ken. Happily, we have a growing movement. As you know, if you were at the conference or if you've seen the conference on the website since, and we have a movement here which intersects China and Russia and forces internationally who represented by those who recognize and are sending messages on LaRouche's power of reason, messages of condolence which identify the unique power of Lyndon LaRouche. But Americans by and large, including the huge Trump support base, the huge Trump army, are not leading, not taking the urgently necessary action. My intention here is to catalyze not an anti-war movement, but a mass movement for peace through national and international economic development. Listen to Jacques Cheminade from the Schiller Conference 2 weeks ago. Cheminade, who is the leader of the French LaRouche movement and Schiller Institute.
Looking at all of us here, I see us with the eyes of the present, with all our imperfections in this terrible moment of humanity. But I see us with the eyes of the future. I am filled with hope, because our lives are shaped by the history of an organization which has always thought and fought to be at the forefront. Hope beyond pain and sorrow, hope across the boundaries of nations and time. It is with confidence in what we will accomplish, mustering the strength of fight to fight and win. It is with confidence that I see the coming world as a world of Lyndon LaRouche. We have before us the possibility of a paradigm change, freeing the world from the destructive grip of the British Empire and its ideology. But it will happen only if all of us become guiding lights ahead of what we are and not followers of easy path. So let's do it. Let's do it because it is our mandate and mission. This conference, to make sense, has to be followed by an unprecedented political organizing to inspire minds, extend our hands to others beyond all parochialisms, personal biases, and borders. Our commitments, a new Bretton Woods, a national bank, public credit, the Glass-Steagall Act, and fusion energy are not mere words or recipes to be repeated, but powerful ideas defining a dynamic unity. If they do not become real, the world, as Lynn told us before, is doomed. The world is doomed. LaRouche's four laws will define the future of humanity if there is going to be one. It is as simple as that. And it is what should make us decide what we will do with our lives. What de Gaulle called at the liberation of Paris our otherwise miserable and short lives. Not by adopting a set of cultish lifesavers, but as an intervention in history which confronts our quality of being human. The human house, at the moment of the human house, is threatened both by financial tsunami and by the flames of war.
So I want to indicate with some help from Vladimir Putin and Helga LaRouche and several others, the reality, the imminence of the flames of war that Jacques is referencing here. But prior to that, I'll reiterate what it is he just said so that it's clear, because this, he says, it is our mandate and our mission. The conference has to be followed by unprecedented political organizing. So we'll get to that here. That is our subject, as it is our mission and mandate. But why don't we look at President Putin from the National Assembly, or is it the Federal Assembly address of February 20, 2 weeks ago in Moscow.
Как мы оцениваем в этой связи ситуацию? Я уже говорил и хочу повторить. Россия не намерена, это очень важно, я повторяю это специально, Россия не намерена первой размещать подобные ракеты в Европе. Если же они действительно будут произведены и поставлены на европейский континент, а США такие планы имеют, во всяком случае, мы не слышали обратных заявлений, то это резко обострит ситуацию в сфере международной безопасности. Создаст для России серьезные угрозы. Ведь у некоторых классов этих ракет подлетное время до Москвы может составить до 10-12 минут. И это и есть очень серьезная угроза для нас. В таком случае мы будем вынуждены, я хочу это подчеркнуть, именно вынуждены предусмотреть зеркальные и асимметричные действия. Что это значит? Скажу уже сегодня, прямо и открыто, чтобы никто нас потом ни в чем не упрекал, чтобы всем было заранее ясно, о чем здесь идет речь. Россия будет вынуждена создать и развернуть виды вооружений, которые могут быть использованы не только в отношении тех территорий, с которых для нас будет исходить соответствующая прямая угроза, но и в отношении тех территорий, где находятся центры принятия решений по применению угрожающих нам ракетных комплексов. Что в этой связи важно? И здесь много новизны. По своим тактико-техническим данным, в том числе по подлетному времени до указанных центров управления, эти вооружения будут вполне соответствовать тем угрозам, которые направлены против России. Знаем, как это сделать, и реализуем эти планы немедленно, как только соответствующие угрозы для нас станут реальными. Не думаю, что международная обстановка сегодня такова, что требует дополнительного и безответственного обострения. Мы этого не хотим. Что здесь хочу добавить? Американские коллеги уже пытались получить абсолютное военное превосходство с помощью глобальной ПРО. Нужно оставить подобные иллюзии. Ответ с нашей стороны всегда будет действенным и эффективным. Работа по перспективным образцам и системам вооружения, о которых говорил в послании прошлого года, продолжается ритмично, без сбоев, по плану. Началось серийное производство комплекса «Авангард», о котором сегодня уже упоминал. В этом году, как и планировалось, им будет оснащен первый полк РВСН. Проводится и цикл испытаний тяжелой, беспрецедентной по мощности межконтинентальной ракеты «Сармат».
President Putin goes on to reference in a press conference the following day the possibility of a Cuban Missile Crisis on the immediate horizon. He said, there are joint mechanisms and instruments for dealing with these problems. I hope they will be used to prevent a new global crisis such as the Cuban Missile Crisis. There are no reasons for this, no reasons for aggravating the international situation to this level. He said, we have mutual complaints and different approaches to problems, and the complaints are mutual, but this is no reason for aggravating this to the level of the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 1960s. Anyway, I think we do not want this. If somebody else wants this, they can do it. Now, remember, this is the president of a nation which defeated fascism, defeated Nazism in a long war, in the Second World War, at the cost of 27 million people in the Soviet Union. The Great Patriotic War. So this, as a sovereign nation, is committed to their security and their future in concert with China, with India, and with the United States. And therefore, take Putin's recent warning, this warning, in the appropriate context and identify the challenge to us in the United States in that regard. Take a series of similar warnings. Do you have this slide? Yeah. Just people may know of this. This is the recent book by Professor Stephen Cohen entitled War with Russia. And his theme, as he puts it, is this. The new U.S.-Russian Cold War, as he calls it, is more dangerous than was its 40-year predecessor, which the world survived. the chances are even greater, as I hope readers already understand, that this one could result, inadvertently or intentionally, in actual war between the two nuclear superpowers. Herein lies another ominous indication. During the preceding Cold War, the possibility of nuclear catastrophe was in the forefront of American mainstream political and media discussion and of policymaking. During the new one, it rarely seems to be even a concern. So my concern is to ensure that this is urgently a much greater concern within the decision-making processes and within the popular mind of the United States. More on Cohen a bit later. Let us take an expression of the same danger with an interesting approach to the solution here. This is a Washington Times column from just a few days ago by Edward Lozansky, who is the president of the American University in Moscow. And he goes through warnings from Cohen and warnings from former Senator Sam Nunn, so on, in terms of what you see on the screen. Are we sleepwalking into nuclear disaster? But he makes a striking point as he concludes. He says, the question is whether U.S. policymakers are willing to risk extinction of the U.S. and the rest of mankind in a futile bid to hold on to a unipolar moment that has passed and brought Americans nothing but debt and danger while it lasted. More on the unipolar idea a bit later. A good start would be a trilateral summit of the leaders of U.S., Russia, and China, or better yet, a quartet that includes India, to start work on parameters of a new constructive international consensus. Everything depends on Mr. Trump, because the other Troika members have already met, and they would definitely accept his invitation. Such a move by Mr. Trump could not only turn around the sleepwalk toward nuclear war, but would help solidify his 2020 win by reminding us why he was elected in the first place. So you recognize the four powers concept, which LaRouche began working on decades ago, and which is at the core of our international organizing today, as we discussed at the conference. Can we put up Helga on the sleepwalkers? This is an EIR report by Helga LaRouche from early November. What does it say there? Early November, in which she begins by saying, during my recent trip to Moscow, in several meetings with representatives of leading institutions, I had the opportunity to get a first-hand impression of how the strategic situation looks from the Russian perspective. Now, what she's referring to is a conference sponsored by the East Asia Division, I believe, of the Russian Academy of Sciences, in which Helga was featured on the panel, as well as a series of private meetings which Helga proceeded to engage in. And it was quite striking when she returned from that trip. She emphasized three things that struck her when she was there. Number one, the difficulties facing Russia economically. Number two, the huge respect that she saw from Russian leaders for Lyndon LaRouche. And number three, the fact that the Russians are preoccupied with this war danger, as opposed to Americans in general. She says in the article, days after her October 23rd address in Moscow, the Deputy Director of Non-Proliferation and Disarmament for the Russian Foreign Ministry, Andrei Belosov, told the UN in New York, quote, recently at a meeting, the U.S. stated that Russia is preparing for war. Yes, Russia is preparing for war. I can confirm it. We are preparing to defend our homeland, our territorial integrity, our principles, our values, our people. We are preparing for such a war. Russia is preparing for war, and the U.S. is preparing a war. Otherwise, why would the U.S. withdraw from the treaty, the INF Treaty, and build a nuclear potential and adopt a new nuclear doctrine? Helga further reports in this, among other things, according to a recent Military Times survey of active U.S. military personnel and officers, 46%, almost half, are convinced that their country will be drawn into a major military conflict with Russia in 2019. I could ask the question if those of you in this audience have thought about this situation in this way, but why don't we get to that upon conclusion of my remarks. Let's take Helga's recent interview in the Russian publication, Russian news service Sputnik, Europe to sign own suicide pact if it hosts new U.S. missiles. Helga said, if Europe were to accept the installation of new U.S. missiles on its territory in this strategic environment, it would sign a suicide pact. President Putin just reintroduced a reality principle and clarity in his February 20 address with his warnings. This is quotes from Helga. Despite President Trump's stated intention to improve relations between the U.S. and Russia, including that he may have one idea of replacing the INF Treaty with a new agreement, Putin has to take into account the contrary intention of the neocons, if you will, the war party, inside his own administration, let alone inside the Congress, inside the leadership of both parties, inside the mainstream media, and so on. I'm elaborating from Helga. And she proposes to reestablish good relations with Moscow by creating an economic zone from the Atlantic to the Pacific on the basis of integrating the Belt and Road Initiative, the Eurasian Economic Union, and the European Union. She's putting forward a further development on the concept of a new international security architecture, which Helga has developed and proffered on multiple occasions. And then she said, when asked to suggest ways to overcome the rifts in the global security environment between Russia and the West, Sepp LaRouche opined that once the real authors of Russiagate were revealed, most of the strategic tensions would evaporate. I think we'll come back to that in terms of certain developments at the conference and subsequent associated with the name Bill Binney, among other things. We'll come back to that. Now, how'd we get here? I mean, this is an existential crisis. Without much attention being paid to it by the man in the street, by the mass media, apparently by the Congress, and so on, as I alluded to earlier. I think it would be extremely useful to go back to a famous broadcast which Lyndon LaRouche did in 1999, which is called Storm Over Asia. It's about 2.5 hours. I will not play the entire thing, but I want to play just his opening to get at the deeper roots which Lynn foresaw and forecast 20 years ago.
What you're seeing is a war in the North Caucasus region on southern Russia. What you're also seeing is a war which is broken out simultaneously in the border between Pakistan and India. The forces behind these attacks on Russia and on India are the same. They are a mercenary force which was first set into motion by policies adopted at a trilateral commission meeting in Kyoto, Japan in 1975. The policies originally of Brzezinski and his number two man there, Samuel P. Huntington. The policies which were continued by then Trilateral Commission member, that is back in 1975, George Bush, before he became vice president. These are policies which were continued by George Bush as vice president. This is under Bush, this became known as the Iran-Contra drug finance link operations of mercenaries deployed with private funding all over the world, recruited from Islamic and other countries, and targeting Russia's flank. This mercenary force, created then, still exists. The primary responsibility for creating the force was the government of the United Kingdom, most notably, most emphatically, the government of Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, a policy which has been accelerated and continued in full madness by the present Prime Minister, Tony Blair of the United Kingdom. This war, if continued, using mercenaries, can lead to nuclear general war. The major powers principally threatened today by this mercenary operation are two of the world's largest nations, China and India. China on its western borders, India on its northern borders. Of course, Iran is also threatened, but more notably, Russia. If these nations are pushed to the wall by a continuing escalation of a war, which is modeled on the wars which the British ran against Russia, China, and so forth during the 19th century and early 20th century, this will lead to the point that Russia has to make the decision to accept disintegration of Russia as a nation, or to resort to the means it has to exact terrible penalties on those who are attacking it, going closer and closer to the source, the forces behind the mercenaries, which includes, of course, Turkey, which is a prime NATO asset being used as a cover for much of this mercenary operation in the North Caucasus and in Central Asia. This is our danger. The weapons the Russians have are no longer the large armies, the capabilities we thought of under the old Orgokov plan of the 1980s. Those vast armies are dissipated, weakened. Russia is ruined almost by a vast economic destruction caused by IMF policies and related policies. But Russia still has an arsenal of advanced weapons, and laboratories which can match the weaponry, most advanced weaponry being developed in the United States, Israel, Britain, and elsewhere. If Russia is pushed to the wall, where it decides to disintegrate willfully or fight back, the likely thing is it will fight back. It will use the weapons it has. It does not have the weapons to win a war, but it has the weapons sufficient to impose a powerful, deadly deterrent on the nations behind the mercenary forces which are presently attacking it. There lies the danger. Unfortunately, most people in the United States are living under the delusion that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the combined military power of the United States and its British Commonwealth allies, including Australia, New Zealand, and so forth, countries that are really under the British Queen personally, as the United Kingdom is, believe that these forces, Anglo-American forces, are so powerful that they can ignore the United Nations Security Council and conduct wars on their own with impunity. Most Americans tend to believe that and believe they don't have to worry about foreign wars. They don't have to worry about terrible things happening in Africa or South America or Eurasia generally. It won't come here just as many Americans said before Pearl Harbor about the war then ongoing in Europe. In reality, it can come here. I'm not predicting that it will. I'm saying the likelihood, the danger exists. And as long as the present policies of our government continue, especially the policies of the right-wing Stone Age faction inside the Congress, the right-wing policies of Vice President Al Gore and of Madeleine Albright, a Brzezinski associate, as long as these policies on the United States' part continue, the danger of war is growing. It's not immediate, not tomorrow, not the day after tomorrow. But wars come on like that. You get to a point of no return. There's still no war. Then somewhere down the line, maybe a couple of years later, the war actually breaks out. And war is breaking out all over the world now. Not only in the Balkans, as we saw recently, not only in an insane bombing attack on Sudan for no reason whatsoever, the continued war against Iraq. Now the
So that was 20 years ago. Consider what's unfolding today. Dennis referenced some of this. The Korean situation, the Southwest Asian situation, the South Asian, India-Pakistan conflict, the Ukraine situation, the INF issue. So we will come back to that. But as he says there, we're not talking about a war today or tomorrow. Well, that was 20 years ago. Perhaps we are. And that, again, defines our mandate and our mission. Now let's go back a bit further. Because you had a moment when Franklin Roosevelt was alive at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in July of 1944, at the point at which it was clear that fascism was being defeated and the Allied forces would win World War II. And FDR put forward his grand design for a post-war world, as his son Elliott Roosevelt describes it in the book As He Saw It. FDR was committed to eliminate the empires, the British, not just the British, but the British and French and Dutch and Portuguese and Spanish empires from the power that they'd enjoyed in one form or other for centuries. And he was proposing to do this by building Africa and Asia and Ibero-America with American system methods, as Roosevelt built the United States with such methods typified by the Tennessee Valley Authority, by the Hoover Dam, the Four Quarters projects, and so on. That is, he was committed to a post-war world without war in the one way that that could occur: peace through collaboration on economic development. Lyndon LaRouche's virtual lifelong commitment was honed during that war against fascism. As he put it to fellow soldiers when FDR died, "I fear that we have lost a great man, a great president, and we've inherited a little man, Truman." And he saw what the British Empire was, as Lynn was soon after the war in India, in Calcutta, amidst the Indian movement, revolution to secure the independence of the country from the British Empire. And Lynn saw the slaughter in Calcutta by the British, the slaughter of thousands in cold blood by the British. He saw from the inside the satanic evil of this British Empire. When the Indians secured their independence, the British, of course, left the subcontinent divided. Pakistan, India, Muslim, Hindu, and so on. The usual British methods. Look at the Russiagate business. The Russiagate is emphatically a British-directed Anglo-American establishment operation to destroy this president because this president is not under British control, to destroy the potential for improved relations with Russia. As reported in Elliot Roosevelt's book, Prime Minister Winston Churchill insisted on the post-war perpetuation of the British Empire. Given the economic predominance of the United States at the end of the war, the Brits had to build on their 20th century imperial geopolitics, the geopolitical strategy which spawned World War I, World War II, and then the Cold War. That is, their insistence upon controlling the heartland of Eurasia, and therefore the entirety of Eurasia, by dividing it in the middle of Europe, of Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe. And their insistence upon establishing what they called a special relationship with the United States. That is, putting the U.S. under their control. Randolph Churchill put it this way to Walter Lippmann the day after Winston Churchill put forward the Iron Curtain conception. He said, "We'll show you, you don't understand the British Empire. Just let me tell you this. We dragged you into 2 wars, and we'll drag you into the 3rd. It's 1946. Or, as it was characterized by various of the Brits, the U.S. is a dumb giant on a British leash. So you consider the pattern, the unfolding process in the wake of World War II, where you have attempts by FDR's intention, JFK's intention, as I'll come to, the Reagan-LaRouche intention through SDI, now Trump's intention to improve relations with Russia, to develop his friendship with Xi Jinping, and so on, to end regime change wars, and to ensure that there's no escalation beyond that, to nuclear war. And what you have is an attempt to consolidate the cooperation of the major powers, in particular, on the common aims of mankind. And then the British War Party, time and again, comes in to bust it up, manipulating both sides to maintain and perpetuate this division of the world, the East-West division, and thus their divide and conquer imperial power, to maintain their empire, their neo-colonial looting, their free trade system, and so on. And they developed, in the course of this, particularly in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but leading into it, the doctrine known as MAD, appropriately known as MAD, mutual and assured destruction. That is a balance of nuclear terror in which the defense of the United States or of the Soviet Union was the ability to retaliate and destroy the other, thereby to prevent the other from attacking. Well, Allen Dulles and company, that is the war party in the Kennedy period, Dulles was the head of the CIA, they, a couple of months after Kennedy's inauguration, attempted to trap Kennedy with the Bay of Pigs operation, an invasion of Cuba. This was a disaster. Kennedy learned the lesson and moved to clean some of these characters out, but in the following year you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which the Soviets, who were, this is not the Russia of today, this is the Soviet Empire in that period, who were facing off against a British Empire manipulating the United States. And the Soviets proceeded to emplace missiles in Cuba. And in the famous 13 days of October, when Kennedy and the U.S. government learned about this, most Americans soon got to church, because for those 13 days, there was people were very aware of the existential danger of that moment. Providentially, JFK had developed a correspondence with Soviet leader Khrushchev. And therefore, Kennedy was able to deploy his brother and others in a back-channel negotiation with Khrushchev based on this ongoing correspondence to work out a deal removing missiles from Cuba, the U.S. removing missiles from Turkey, the NATO country Turkey, on the Russian-Soviet border. And you had a diffusing of what could well have led to an imminent U.S. military attack of one form or other on Cuba, which could have led to nuclear war. This is fascinating that at that point, or soon thereafter, JFK proffered in the American University speech about 8 months later, proffered to Moscow the establishment of a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty, a serious move toward disarmament. And a few months after that, let's see if I have what he said, Kennedy went to the United Nations and he said, this is September of 1963 at the General Assembly, where he called for a genuine détente between the great powers through mutual interest cooperation. I'll quote Kennedy, "I include among these possibilities for great power cooperation a joint expedition to the moon." Now, this is less than a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Why should man's first flight to the moon be a matter of national competition? Why should the U.S. and the Soviet Union become involved in immense duplications of research, construction, and expenditure? Surely we should explore whether the scientists and astronauts of our two countries, indeed of all the world, cannot work together in the conquest of space. Sending someday in this decade to the moon, not the representatives of a single nation, but the representatives of all of our countries. End quote. 2 months later, he was shot and murdered. And think about that initiative by JFK in the FDR tradition, and you have one very clear reason why the British party, out of UK and US, why the British party moved to kill that president. Meanwhile, in the ensuing period, you have the development of regional wars, proxy wars, as in Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War, which the British pulled the United States into after they killed Kennedy and removed Kennedy's impulse to pull our advisors out of Vietnam. That these are wars under the threshold of superpower nuclear war. That is, you can just create wars in Southwest Asia or Southeast Asia or Ibero-America or Africa, as long as it doesn't cross the threshold leading to nuclear war. That was the logic or the rationale of the MAD, mutual assured destruction, balance of terror. Southeast Asia was devastated in that war, and so was the United States, in terms of the imposition in this country of the British system. Deindustrialization, post-industrial society, Prince Philip's, quote, environmentalism, which is to say depopulation based on no science, and so on, as today with the Green New Deal, with the so-called climate change, as well as the imposition of a drug, rock, sex counterculture in this country, which devastated the culture, the educational system, the economic capability, the mindset of the American population. Let's jump ahead. 20 years later, as Soviet and American medium-range missiles, with a range of a few hundred miles to a few thousand miles, as the Soviet SS-20s and American Pershing missiles were emplaced in Central and Eastern Europe on the Western side, the American NATO side, and inside the Soviet Union. But closer and closer to each, you had a strategic crisis which was exploding. And happily, we had a president, like Trump in important respects, with the courage to act, and to act with Lyndon LaRouche. Can I have the slide of the Sputnik of the 70s? When Jimmy Carter was elected, LaRouche warned that Brzezinski and company, and think back to what you saw in Storm Over Asia, but LaRouche was already warning and we had been organizing to prevent an escalation in Europe of such a strategic confrontation, which could explode into world war. LaRouche, based on intelligence from inside the U.S. military, from inside the Pentagon, learned about the Soviet intention to develop a ballistic missile defense, a beam weapon defense, to Sputnik the United States in terms of such a strategic defense operation. And this was published in 1977 and led in the ensuing period to a president, Reagan, who brought LaRouche into the administration unofficially, under security clearance, as a back channel to the Soviets based on LaRouche's proposal, which proposal begins with that publication. Can we see LaRouche and Reagan? This is the famous picture of Lynn with Ronald Reagan, candidate Reagan in New Hampshire in 1980. And at the end, when Reagan won the election, Reagan and many of his associates in California were readers of EIR magazine from at least 1974. Reagan is elected in 1980. Reagan approaches LaRouche's associates after the election and requests recommendations from LaRouche. What is your wish list? And Lynn had a series of wishes having to do with international economic cooperation and development and so on. Reagan selected one thing, which the policy that Reagan calls the Strategic Defense Initiative. Let me, for lack of the video, let me just quote. March 23rd, 1983, President Reagan proposed to the Soviet Union the SDI, what he called Strategic Defense Initiative, what LaRouche had called ballistic missile defense, based on the new physical principles, directed energy, laser beam, ion beam, and so on capability. Reagan said, "I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind's and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. We seek neither military superiority nor political advantage. Our only purpose, one all people share, is to reduce the danger of nuclear war." And Reagan, Defense Secretary Weinberger, picked up from LaRouche, who had been deployed by Reagan's National Security Council as a back channel to the Kremlin to sound out the Soviet leadership. If the President of the United States proposed a defense strategy of this sort and proposed it as collaboration between the two powers, to use the scientific, as Reagan had put it, the scientific talents which had developed nuclear weapons, the scientific capability of America and the Soviet Union to defeat nuclear weapons, the question that LaRouche posed to them was, what would your response be? And Reagan's defense secretary immediately proffered this to the Kremlin. It was rejected by Andropov, the Soviet leader at that moment, who was heavily influenced by this British Empire. Again, the invariant throughout this period is British intelligence operations in the Soviet Union and in the United States, among other nations, which therefore led to the failure of the promise of SDI, led to the failure of SDI moving forward collaboratively. Reagan was shot 2 months into his administration, not after this speech, but early on in the administration, shot and almost assassinated. But it was well known to the British intelligence crowd that this relationship that LaRouche had developed with Reagan, portending this kind of breakthrough, well known that this was in process. Reagan is shot. The British faction inside his administration, led by Vice President George Bush, President to Vice George Bush, and the British Bush crowd take greater control over that administration. And soon after this SDI, within weeks after this SDI breakthrough, a Get LaRouche task force is established in Manhattan, coming out of the Department of Injustice, and related government and private operations, and eventually, with the assistance of Robert Mueller, amoral legal assassin Robert Mueller, the same guy, LaRouche is framed up after years of slander and so on and so forth, framed up and jailed. But at a crucial moment in this process, Reagan and Gorbachev meet, famous Reykjavik summit, which is around October 6th and 7th of 1986. And what the British faction, typified by George Shultz and so on, say to Reagan is, you've got to give up this SDI in such a way that then you and Gorbachev can work something out. At the very moment that this summit's going on, there was a huge raid on LaRouche, on our headquarters in Leesburg, Virginia, and on LaRouche's home, with the intention by some to kill LaRouche. Very moment. Reagan had the courage to say no, or did he say niet? I don't know. In any case, Reagan said, I'm not giving up the SDI. And as you may have heard in discussions in the last few days about the Trump-Kim summit, when Trump walked out, Reagan walked out of that summit. A year later, there was a treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Reduction Treaty, Intermediate Nuclear Force Missiles Treaty, the INF Treaty. This is the only treaty which actually eliminated a whole class of weapons. One of the pillars of one of the elements of this extreme strategic war danger. If you have weapons which are of limited range, as in the INF weapons, then perhaps they could be used in a limited nuclear war, as was thought by some. In any case, Reagan succeeded by '87 in a different kind of breakthrough. Okay, so let's then fast forward, because LaRouche had forecast the end of the Soviet Empire within about 5 years in 1983, if the Soviets failed to collaborate with the United States on the development of such a defense. He was a little off. It took 6 years. But the Soviet Empire came down. And that opened up a huge historic opportunity, which LaRouche, from prison, intervened into, proposing the what was first called the European Productive Triangle, and then the Eurasian Land Bridge, to take Western Europe as an engine of the economic development to the east. You see the cover in the German edition, the Productive Triangle, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, locomotive for world economic development, for the world economy. And then you have the other one. What's it say there? Eurasian Rail Project paves road to peace. Cover of VIR, that's 1990, I think. Is that right? Yeah. And 92? 92. But this is what has become through our work, through Helga's work and so on, has become the new Silk Road, the Eurasian Land Bridge. This is what the LaRouches put on the table at the point that the Soviet Empire comes down. Instead, you have an agreement between Gorbachev to acquiesce in Germany, a reunified Germany, joining NATO. In return, President Bush I, Margaret Thatcher, so on, made a solemn pledge. NATO will not move 1 inch east of Berlin. Well, not only did NATO soon thereafter start gobbling up nations. I think NATO went from 13 countries to, is it 27 or 28 now? NATO, over this period, has deployed massively to the borders of Russia. But at the same time, what you have, Glaziev, you have that there, is you have a horrible looting, destruction, deindustrialization, and depopulation of Russia, beginning in 91, 92. Yeah, there it is. This is, we'll say more about Sergei Glaziev in a moment, but in the back of Glaziev's book, which was translated and published by EIR, translated from the Russian into English, Glaziev writes, "The rate of annual population loss has been more than double the rate of loss during the period of Stalinist repression and mass famine in the first half of the 1930s. There has been nothing like this in the 1,000-year history of Russia." So instead of the Eurasian land bridge unfolding to unify the giant Eurasian landmass through economic, scientific, infrastructural cooperation, instead you have the British, London, Wall Street, the financial empire looting the hell out of this country. This leads us to 99, when you saw what LaRouche emphasized in his Storm over Asia. Well, soon thereafter, somewhat coherent with LaRouche's warnings of 99, you have 9/11. The United States is attacked. Anybody know the first head of state who contacted President Bush within moments of that attack? Okay, we have an informed audience. Putin contacts Bush, or Condoleezza Rice, and Rice says, "You realize we're on strategic alert." And Putin said, "Yes, we know, and we are standing down." And Putin then offers cooperation with the Bush administration to actually engage in a war against terrorism. Instead of accepting such cooperation, you have a series of wars that are launched, beginning Afghanistan, through Iraq, through Libya, through Syria, the various regime change wars, and you have, soon after 9/11, you have the withdrawal of the United States from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which indicates an intention by the United States over time to develop perhaps a war-winning first strike capability. Let's go back one step. That what you saw in 91, 92, and since, through the present day, the policies of British intelligence, of Chatham House, of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, in the U.S. it was called the Wolfowitz Doctrine, to develop and impose a unipolar world, one pole, one hegemon, a United States domination of the world. Of course, it wasn't United States domination, it was Anglo-American. Dumb giant on a British leash, because it was an insane reaction to an historic breakthrough. The intention of these wars, which continue, though Trump is attempting urgently to pull out remaining American troops from Syria, Afghanistan, so on. But the intention of this was to ensure that there was no cooperation of the powers to generate the kind of international economic development that LaRouche had been proposing, to create a new Bretton Woods system. Fast forward to the coup of 2013, 2014 in Ukraine. Neo-Nazis were deployed on the Maidan with about $5 billion in U.S. funds to bring down the Yanukovych government, which was not just friendly to Russia, but open to the European Union. There was no military invasion of Crimea, as has been said. There was no annexation of Crimea. There was a referendum in that section, formerly of Ukraine, but for centuries prior, that section of Russia. and the referendum was an overwhelming demand of that population to return Crimea to Russia. You put Nazis in power in Ukraine, which is what was done by the Obama government with their British and other friends. You put Nazis in power in Kiev, in Ukraine, on the border of Russia. Think back to the Russian history. And you dramatically ratchet up the strategic confrontation. You then attack a new American president for trying to redress this by engaging, by developing improved relations with the other leading nuclear power, Russiagate, so on. This is the British House of Lords strategy. Can we go to the House of Lords there? Dennis referenced this, so I won't elaborate. I'll take one thing on that, which is this is that what LaRouche PAC, EIR, the Schiller Institute did, accomplished over the last months, was to pin down the authorship of the ongoing destabilization through Russiagate and through these their various strategic moves, including the withdrawal from the INF Treaty. And as we put it, with Barbara Boyd put it in our LaRouche PAC and related material on this, quote from this report, or from her review of this report. In the U.S., they have one immediate goal, ending the disruption caused by Trump by removing him one way or the other. They found that the special relationship, British control of the United States, called special relationship, was intact and revered in U.S. intelligence and defense establishments, and especially on both sides of the aisle in Congress. But that relationship is threatened by the continuation of the Trump presidency. Therefore, their insistence upon removing Trump, or one way or the other, crippling him, ensuring that he's not more than one term. And Barbara stresses, with respect to Russia, they plan to continue their policy of containment, economic isolation, and political destabilization, and to ensure their destabilization and degrees of control over India and China. Their target is the four powers.
It is the reason why the present situation is so dangerous. The British Empire and its Anglo-American form, you know, British brains and American muscle, is fully aware of its own weaknesses in the world to come, and is playing its last card in this domain. It is acting like a wounded tiger, this wounded tiger of the British narratives about the colonial universe, a wounded tiger which becomes a manhunter. It means control of communications and weapons on Earth and military control on the outer space. Donald Trump, whatever his flaws, does not come from that underworld of educated criminals. He, as a good business person, wants to reach peace in the world to make good deals. He is not ideologically flawed like the Wall Street City of London politicians. He utterly dislikes the warmongers of the CIA or the FBI. That's why the Anglo-American oligarchy wants to get rid of him and rid of his close friends. Even worse is the dismantling of all the international arrangements made during the Cold War to prevent an open military conflict. The United States withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the ABM Treaty, in 2002, and has deployed those anti-missile weapons around the Russian borders in Europe, despite the fact that they had been promised at the fall of the Berlin Wall, that NATO forces would only go in the former East Germany and not further. It has been acknowledged in the meantime that such anti-ballistic missiles can eventually, with the recent technological progress, be transformed into ballistic weapons. The US recently announced that it will leave the Intermediate Nuclear Forces, the INF Treaty, within 6 months if Russia did not destroy its 9M721 missile and associated systems. But in the meantime, the US itself is producing low-yield nuclear warheads like the W-76-2 for the US Navy, for the US Navy's Trident submarine-launched ballistic missile. As Boston-based journalist John Carroll said, it is not designed against another country launching its nukes. Mad. This is a mutual assured destruction. But this time, this is a weapon that can make the unthinkable thinkable. As for the START Treaty, there are no real signs of new negotiations from its third version or New START, beyond its third version of the New START, which is going to end in 2021, February 2021. Adding to that, the intended militarization of outer space, in contradiction with the spirit of the Demilitarization Treaty of 1967, if you add that, the conditions are met for an extremely dangerous situation, even more dangerous than under MAD, the Mutually Assured Destruction Treaty, during the Cold War. The best experts consider that the world military situation is potentially even more dangerous today than under the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962.
So we can and must defeat this. But to defeat the new emerging danger, it is necessary that the leaders of a movement to create the future, to create the LaRouche world, as Jacques referenced at the beginning of his remarks, that people, where necessary, have to change their axioms. To quote Yitzhak Rabin in the famous Oslo Accord, where he proposed a toast to those with the courage to change their axioms. So let me reference a couple of elements of this before I deploy Ben Deniston and Helga Zepp-LaRouche and Sergei Glaziev to conclude this. That you take the case of Professor Cohen, who I referenced earlier, who was a courageous figure in sounding the alarm. But Cohen, as he puts in his book, he cites a perilous paradox. Why, unlike the 40-year Cold War, is there no significant mainstream opposition to the new and more dangerous Cold War? He says, I cannot explain this exceedingly dangerous paradox. He opines, the fault lies with America's governing elites. He misses the nature of the beast that he's dealing with. It's not just the America's governing elites, but it's the control by this British ideology of those elites. Dumb giant on a British leash. If you are fighting a war, you better have an idea of the enemy, of the mindset of the enemy, of the strategy, and of the weakness, the vulnerability of that enemy. And if you miss the enemy, you're not going to win the war. In this case, we're not going to stop the war. What's the nature of this British disease? Globalization, geopolitics, the neoliberal system of free trade. The problem we have, that Trump has, is he, despite his best intention to improve relations and so on, and to move into this four-power geometry potentially, despite many things which Trump has done and will do toward a Westphalian world, that is, a world in which nation-states come together to secure their common interests, the common interests of humanity, what Trump's doing in Southwest Asia, what Trump did at Singapore and is working toward in East Asia, around Korea. Trump, with Putin, with Xi, have intervened in the last 48 hours into the India-Pakistan situation. More from Helga on this. But you have to be precise as to the nature of the enemy here. You have to take up the economic and financial dimension. And this is a weakness in Cohen's work and otherwise. as Riemann put it, we have to move from the Department of Mathematics to the Department of Physics, in this case, physical economy. What is the physical, economic, as well as financial reality in the world? The system is bankrupt. The British system, the London Wall Street system, is bankrupt. It's coming down. They are therefore a wounded beast, as Jacques said, and extremely dangerous. But they're vulnerable on this. Therefore, if you put forward an actual program, a positive conception, not merely a détente idea, which is what many of the better people, Cohen and many others, desired years ago, carried forward years ago, and desire now. Détente will not work. It's a useful step if you can do it, but you need entente in terms of a four powers combination. And you need to unify the four powers around their common interests, as in economic development, scientific progress, infrastructural development, and so on as the unique basis for peace. The name for that is LaRouche, who is the physical economist in the world. And therefore, the general blindness on the British question, goes directly to the decades-long induced hysteria about LaRouche, because LaRouche identified in the 1970s the actual enemy of America and of humanity. And it's not, quote, the American elites, though many of those elites are in the British camp, but it is this British ideology, British intelligence, as you see with Trump. Let me just, before going to Ben Deniston, to unfold the actual tremendous potential which we have as we developed it at the conference. Let me try to make this as uncomfortable as I can for some of you, perhaps. Because, as I put it, I was thinking about it, to win this strategic war against empire, on behalf of humanity, you have to go after various axioms, and you really have to think them through and change them. For example, that there's no British Empire after 1945, but an American empire. Axiom number one. Axiom number two, that the left-right, east-west, communist-capitalist division of the world is fixed and eternal. So how could you bring people together when they're divided? That the British system of monetarism, international financial speculation, globalization, looting, drugs, is somehow equivalent to the American system of capitalism. That there's no actual profound and systemic distinction between the historic British system, imperial system, and the American Republican system. That, as Sean Hannity puts it, unfortunately, the salacious lying Steele dossier, which is that, is pushing Russian lies. What Russians is he talking about? Not Putin, not the Russian government. These are British lies. Remember, I'm describing axioms which are out there in the popular mind and the mass media and the Congress and so on. That the historic breakthrough of One Belt, One Road, the new Silk Road, is China. Is it the Chinese communists? Is that our enemy? Are they they're imposing debt traps and enslaving the world? Another axiom which is out there and which you see in various places, that the world, another axiom, is governed by zero-sum games. We win, you lose, as opposed to a win-win conception, as the Chinese have put it forward, through the One Belt, One Road, as against the Westphalian idea of nations acting for the benefit of the other, which is in their own benefit. So again, if you're stuck in these kinds of axioms, we will not generate the quality of movement required to break through. Well, let me rely on LaRouche basement science team leader Ben Deniston to take up one crucial element of this from our conference, the Schiller Conference 2 weeks ago.
So the strategic defense of Earth is a particular phrase that was named in direct reference to the Strategic Defense Initiative, the SDI, Mr. LaRouche's program. So if we truly want to understand the SDE and what Mr. LaRouche saw in the SDE and the importance of this policy, we really have to look to his original conception of the SDI. And I think this question summarizes the policy in a broader perspective. What is the scientific basis of a sustainable peace among the leading powers of the planet? I had a little bit more to say, but I wanted to reference, I was very happy Helga actually directed me to this document by Mr. LaRouche from 1984 as insights into his broadest conception of what the SDI policy was really about. It's the LaRouche Doctrine draft memorandum between the United States of America and the USSR. And in here he discusses his strategic policy, the SDI. But this article is composed, this memorandum is composed of 7 articles. It's not until literally the 5th article, over halfway through the document, that Mr. LaRouche actually mentions anything about military policy or about the beam defense policy, which was his conception of the Strategic Defense Initiative. Skip over a couple of things here. The opening, very opening of Article 1, Mr. LaRouche says, the political foundation for a durable peace, and I skipped over, but I just mentioned, this is, again, coming up today, missile defense, strategic defense, you know, the Trump administration, there's people looking at these issues. It's clear that we still, as has been said in this conference, and as many people realize, we still sit at a very dangerous situation where we're not that far from the outbreak of nuclear war, which is, you know, you're still looking at the potential annihilation of civilization. That threat is still real. So this whole SDI, SDE discussion has still incredible strategic importance. So to get to Mr. LaRouche's insights into this question, what is the basis of a sustainable peace among the leading powers of the world? He opens his document as follows. The political foundation for a durable peace must be A, the unconditional sovereignty of each and all nation states, and B, cooperation among sovereign nation states to the effect of promoting unlimited opportunities to participate in the benefits of technological progress to the mutual benefit of each and all. The genius of Mr. LaRouche's program, and I just recommend people read this document in its entirety, it's not very long. The genius of Mr. LaRouche's SDI was really the science driver characteristic. The directed energy systems, as you see depicted here, the technological capabilities to defeat nuclear missiles required major technological breakthroughs. And if those technologies were implemented in the civilian economies, in the US, the Soviet Union, and other nations, they could generate massive increases in the productive powers of labor, major increases in the potential relative population density of all economies involved. And combining this science driver program with a technology transfer program to the formerly colonized world, allowing so-called third world nations to become modern, industrialized, and productive economies participating in these advanced technologies. LaRouche knew this was the only true scientific and lasting basis for peace.
For peace. For time reasons, let me skip over some things. The way Ben put it as he developed this, even though LaRouche's SDI program at the time was not successfully implemented, echoes of this perspective continued following the fall of the Soviet Union. Interestingly, it was right around this time that leading scientific figures began to realize the active threat of asteroid and comet impacts with Earth. Veterans of the SDI and parallel efforts in Russia came together around the idea of joint U.S.-Russian cooperation in defending the Earth from the threat of asteroid and comet impacts. There was a series of high-level international conferences on the subject in leading U.S. and Russian institutions. Many of these were the high-technology laboratories involved in missile defense, nuclear weapons research. But what happened was something that the Russians proposed in the 90s, Strategic Defense of Earth, SDE. As Ben put it, in 2011, the idea of U.S.-Russian cooperation in asteroid defense was again put on the table. And he proceeds to develop the existential urgency of the superpower cooperation in advanced areas of science to defend our planet from asteroid or comet hits on Earth with potentially catastrophic consequences, among other problems like the huge solar flares and so on and so forth. In any case, as you see, an echo of LaRouche's SDI, now called SDE. We were caused to write a document for the Russian BRICS website called The Trump Presidency, A New Opportunity for the BRICS. This is by Schiller Institute leader Richard Black, quoting Helga extensively, but he begins the article, during a press conference in Moscow on November 19, a few months ago, following a conference marking the 20th anniversary of the International Space Station, Roscosmos Director Dmitry Rogozin and NASA's Manned Mission Director Bill Gerstenmaier affirmed the strength of the Russian-American cooperation in space. Quote, "We absolutely trust each other, and political winds have not touched us," Rogozin said. Gerstenmaier spoke in kind, noting that space exploration has driven us together as effective partners that could be an example to the outside world. Human spaceflight is unique in the fact that it requires absolute trust between each other. To make this work, we have to be totally transparent with each other. End quote. Echoes of JFK's proposal, echoes of SDI cooperation, and the LaRouche proposal for a Moon-Mars mission, which he made in 1985, and so on. You see this potential here. Let me go directly to the situation today with the help of Helga LaRouche, who in her weekly Schiller Institute webcast of yesterday, which is on our websites, identifies the method of thinking which is required for us to develop a quality of leadership in our ranks and rapidly far beyond our ranks to resolve the existential crisis and to bring about the coming LaRouche world.
Brings up one of the other questions that needs to be resolved, which is the tension that's emerged over the U.S. Threat to withdraw from the INF Treaty. This is in the background. This brings up again lowering the threshold for nuclear war. What's your thought about where this is headed?
Well, I think, it is definitely a very dangerous development because, it may be that President Trump wants to accomplish some other treaty, replacing the INF, but this is a very tricky question. I think that, there is not so much the immediate danger that you would have immediately medium-range US nuclear weapons deployed in Europe, because as far as I know, there are no such weapon systems in the pipeline which could be established immediately. If there were to be positioned there, it would basically bring us back right to the situation of the beginning of the 80s, where you had only a few minutes, and therefore all the forces of the Warsaw Pact and NATO were on launch on warning. But, I think the more immediate situation is that it opens a Pandora box, because once you break down all disarmament or arms control treaties, like the ABM system, ABM treaty has been cancelled many years ago now, the INF treaty, it basically brings down any kind of treaty arrangements, and it could lead to all kinds of developments. This brings me to the point I have made many times. I mean, obviously, some people say that behind that is the effort to get the Chinese into an INF agreement. But, as some experts were writing in the recent period, it's not very likely that the Chinese could agree or would agree, because if you just have an INF approach, it would mean that the Chinese would have to give about more than 2/3 of their entire missile arsenal, which they obviously will not do under these circumstances. It brings me to the point which I have said many times. If you look at the totality of all of these problems, Venezuela, North Korea, India, Pakistan, then the whole situation of Southwest Asia, which remains extremely fragile, the situation with Ukraine, I mean, all of these things have the potential of leading to a large, if not the final catastrophe of a third world war. And, given the fact that, the old paradigm is collapsing, it's disintegrating, and there are people and forces representing this old paradigm who are pushing confrontation, I think it is extremely urgent to recognize that either humanity moves to a completely new type of thinking, a new paradigm where you basically establish a system of new international relations which takes into account the security interests, the economic interests, the political interests of all nations. And the only way how you can do that is to establish a higher order of a system, a new paradigm which overcomes geopolitics and puts humanity as one first, and then all national and regional interests second. Now that is what Xi Jinping has been proposing with his new Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the idea that we have to build a community of shared interest for the future of mankind. And, you can see right now that it is that idea which is being fought by many of the neocons in the United States. For example, Marco Rubio, Mitt Romney just came out basically attacking the Confucius Institutes as if these schools where the Chinese language and culture is being taught, as if these would represent the biggest threat to the national security interest of the United States. But I think it is really very important that we develop a different kind of thinking to approach all of these problems, because I think that the idea of Nicolaus of Cues, who thought these things in the 15th century already, that in order to solve problems, you need the coincidence of opposites, the coincidentia oppositorum, as an approach to solve problems, that you find the higher level of reason where the problems which on a lower Aristotelian level of contradiction are looking insolvable can be solved. And that is what Albert Einstein also expressed in a different way. He said, you will never find a solution with the same method which caused the problem to arise. And that
there's more on this, which I urge you to look at on the LaRouche PAC website or the Schiller website. But final point, Glaziev. So I said at the outset that what you saw at the conference was a direct initiative and intervention by the Russian government around LaRouche, the person of Lyndon LaRouche, of Helga LaRouche, and so on. And as many of you know, we are heavily mobilized to break through on the exoneration of LaRouche and to get the truth of LaRouche, LaRouche's life's work, LaRouche's ideas out in the open. And we are soliciting messages. Messages are streaming in from leaders internationally. I mentioned Sergei Glaziev before. He is an advisor to the Putin government. He says, I don't think you can see it there, but I'll quote two things he says in here. A great thinker of our time, Lyndon LaRouche has left us. He was a titan of thought, a man of incredibly encyclopedic knowledge, great soul, and love for humanity. His concept of a Eurasian development bridge from Western Europe to Russia's Far East and onward to Alaska and the USA could become a real alternative to today's hybrid world war. And he goes on, I remember one of the leaders of the Brookings Institution urging me in a whisper not to have any contact with LaRouche so as not to spoil my reputation. For me, who had come to the USA to take part in a scientific forum on issues of developing democratic institutions in the post-Soviet region, this was shocking. From then on, I started closely reading LaRouche's publications and attending conferences he organized. And I must acknowledge that his presentations were often a ray of light in the kingdom of darkness and hypocrisy which had seized the public mind of progressive mankind. Today, those ideas are coming to life in a new world economic paradigm. As you have leaders of Russia and China and India, and we already have a good number of them, and of the United States in particular, who are coming together around LaRouche's power of reason, LaRouche's ideas, LaRouche's policies, that defines a movement that can win, as opposed to the college try or whatever it is. The Russian government is playing the LaRouche card. The Chinese, to the extent that the new paradigm of one belt, one road and its Confucian methodological roots is transforming the world, are playing it as well. That the method of thinking that Helga is identifying there is the basis to create a Westphalian universe, to create this coming future for which we organized the conference. That's the challenge put to us by Helga. It is now up to us to realize Lyndon LaRouche's life's work. So thank you.
Okay, we're going to go to questions in just a minute. In fact, I'd like to have a sense of who has questions right now. Because, okay, good, very good. We are going to interpolate something, however, and the microphone is open, so whoever has the first question or comment, just come up and make it. Who do we have? Okay. John, you want to go first? Why don't you go? Because Patrick, you can just get in right behind him. Go ahead.
Hi, John Sigerson. I'm glad that you brought up all of these assumptions that people have, but I wanted to add one, which to me is one of the most pernicious, stupid assumptions, which is, yeah, but the Russians and the Chinese, they always violate human rights. They don't have any human rights in China and Russia. I think we should really lay this on. People are a little bit afraid to talk about this because they don't know quite how to handle it. And I just realized it's very simple. It's more of a musical question. The U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Confederate Constitution, the British-backed Confederate Constitution, says life, liberty, and property. Now, when you talk about that, that's not just three things. Those are an idea. It's a unit. That is, when you say life, liberty, and the third thing is a piece of crap. right, which is property, which means my things, what my things are, what I have had in the past defines who I'm going to be in the future. It completely changes the meaning of the first two, the life and the liberty. Whereas you have life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness is a forward, outgoing, generous idea of the pursuit of everybody's happiness, not just your own personal happiness. It's the pursuit of actually being a truly creative human being. And that's precisely the problem when people are saying, that they're violating human rights. What they're actually saying is no, the Chinese are violating what my conception is of not really human rights, but I would call them animal rights. That is, my rights as an animal, to have things and so forth. And I just think I think that people should really think about what their real human right is. And I think that we really have to call people out on the table on this question of human rights. That is, do you really have an absolute right to property? If you really believe that's axiomatic in your whole idea of who you are as a human being, you've got a problem. And I think people should really think about anybody who brings up this thing about what the Chinese are doing is somehow, violating human rights. Anyway, that's the first thing. The second thing, just one more thing, which is it's wonderful that you brought up the entire history going back all the way basically from the Second World War. However, history goes back way beyond that. Way beyond that. Now, I want to just bring up one aspect, which is this question of the so-called Thucydides trap, which is talked about a lot now. It's bandied about. And most people have no conception of what this actually means, because they probably have never even read Thucydides, which I highly recommend people read. But it has to do with another great war, which at that point wasn't thank God it wasn't a nuclear war, but it was a war between Athens and Sparta. But what people don't, and I'll make this really short, what people don't realize, and it's never discussed, is the fact that in that case, what was lurking behind that clash was the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire, which is now the modern-day British Empire, was the thing that was manipulating both sides of that, and led to the complete destruction of of everything that was good about Athens, turned Athens into a terrible dictatorship, actually, and then used this other throwaway power, which was this agricultural-based soldier state of Sparta, which didn't have any possibility of actually continuing. And they used that as a throwaway state to destroy both. But it was the Persian Empire that was actually in the controlling aspect of this whole thing, and that's never adequately discussed. And I think people should just keep that in mind, that this is a long-standing fight against empire. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad that you came back to the axioms, to the assumptions first. I have several things on what you're saying. Jacques, in that same speech, emphasized that the greatest contributor to destruction is pessimism. The underlying axiom that cripples the thinking of much of our citizenry is pessimism, as against the methodological optimism of Lyndon LaRouche. In the Food for Peace presentation that we cited on the websites and so on right after Lynn's passing, or going into that and so on, Lynn emphasizes, he says something like, if we act out of love for humanity, for the hundreds of billions of unborn souls waiting to be born, that our interest is their interest, though they're not yet born. If we act so, out of a commitment to the cup, accepting the cup of Gethsemane, he says, I am certain we shall win. That's how he acted. That's how this movement acts. But this is as against the empire, the Persian Empire of today, the British Empire, which is committed to a Thucydides trap outcome of the present moment of history. That is, if the Chinese win, we all lose, or vice versa, the rising power and the dominant power. What about the common interest of the powers of all of humanity? What about the Confucian conception of the harmony, and a conception which is rooted in a harmonious conception of man, society, and the universe? That's what Lin has put forward over these decades. Finally, the human rights question. China is criticized for violating human rights. Where's the evidence? But it's a more interesting fundamental question, which is China has succeeded, as is widely known, in lifting 700, 800 million people within China out of poverty. Well, that's pretty good for the human rights of those people, as they're doing with the One Belt, One Road, creating a future for humanity and therefore human rights to much of mankind.
Hi, I'm Patrick from Connecticut, and I totally believe in climate change, especially when a meteor or an asteroid or any space object that hits the Earth. The SDI is the only solution to the climate threat. That's my first statement. STE, excuse me. But we know what it is. There's a saying, all it takes for evil to succeed is a few good men to do nothing. Our job is to find these good men and drag them, enroll them. Well, you got the point. My team activists, what we've been doing is distributing Mr. LaRouche's obituary to libraries, police departments, fire departments, businesses, newspapers, one-on-one with editors, and the VA hospital, where there are thousands of veterans that are forgotten. And they need to know what the truth is. And I think if we could set up like a seminar and teach these, because they're there and they're not going anywhere. So I think we should bring something to them so they can, become part of this. And I think that's about it. I think we have to start, doing extraordinary things, and whatever it is, just take it and run with it. Don't be afraid of what somebody says, or this isn't right, or go against it, because nothing else is going to happen unless you become bold and extraordinary. And with that, I yield.
Just one response on that, which is in the period ahead, as this the multitude of crises unfold, there are going to be increasing opportunities, requirements, and so on for this movement to teach and to lead, because we are the leadership. So I just pose that back to you, Patrick, as a challenge, and challenge to everyone here and the broader audience, of actually working through. The reason I chose to go into some depth on the history and so on is it is urgent that people actually work this through and counter to your prevailing assumptions and axioms, like methodological pessimism, which does poison the population, if not our movement. People have to work this through in such a way that everyone here can teach and lead and organize, much as you're organizing.
Thank you.
Say it again. Yeah. Can someone help the gentleman?
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so just in light of what you were discussing about how people don't tend to want to address reality, there's different reasons that you brought up for that. But the main thing I was thinking of when you discussed this was that, well, one, all the things that you had brought up about positive developments with different countries working together as really the solution to establish peace, not in some stupid hippie way or something like that, but actual policies where you consolidate really a no possibility for a nuclear war at that point. But what still disconcerts me is that when Trump met with Putin in Helsinki, one of the proposals that they had discussed was that you'd have a group to tackle the cybernetic problem. And one of the fears when I speak to people about a nuclear war is that the US is using all its power and with technology and computers to take out the Russian capabilities. And so to me, that is a very disconcerting thing. And the issue of Mueller stopping Trump from meeting with Putin and allowing this whole process to unfold makes us in a huge danger, in my opinion.
Two things you might want to add. I was looking recently at a short video on Tucker Carlson from mid-July, with Professor Cohen, Professor Stephen Cohen. And this is at the point of the Helsinki summit. And Cohen makes the point that from Eisenhower through the present, every American president has met with the Soviet leaders, Soviet chairman, the Russian presidents, and so on, for the purpose of preventing escalation to thermonuclear superpower confrontation. Trump attempts to do that. They get together in Helsinki, and as you may recall, Trump is attacked throughout the American mainstream media, throughout elements of the Congress, both parties, as a traitor for doing his duty as the President of the United States to engage with the Russian leader so as to work through problems, like the cybernetic problem you're referencing, like the arms problems, like the terrorism problems, the strategic problems, and so on and so forth. Cohen he says, I've never seen anything like this. And he's been studying this for 50 years. And he says, what's needed here is a psychiatrist. Let's get a psychiatrist on the case. What the hell is going on here? It goes to things I was referencing earlier. The point is that Trump has an enormous problem, which I alluded to. I think I quoted Helga on this in her Sputnik interview. People here know it. Here you have the President of the United States who has a clear impulse. 1,000 times he stated the intention to use his office, the American presidency, to improve relations. And then he takes these initiatives like withdrawing from Syria or any number of initiatives he's taken. And people inside his administration, the neocon war party, Pence, Pompeo, Bolton, they bash Russia. They bash China. Trump keeps saying, I have a wonderful friendship and relationship, a crucial friendship with the president of China, Xi Jinping. As a matter of fact, I'm hoping to sit down with him in a summit this month to consolidate U.S.-China trade and economic relations, progress which is ongoing. And this bunch of war party SOBs surrounding Trump, the intelligence leadership, Coates, the Director of National Intelligence, and the whole array of these bastards say Trump is wrong on all of these things.
Yeah, because the thing is that Trump actually was inspired by what Reagan did, but by what LaRouche did in the past to establish peace in the world. And for them to force his hand so that he backs out of the INF treaty, in that sense, it doesn't really cohere with the impulse that he has really been going towards, because his impulse is it's a good thing to work with Russia. It's actually a positive in the world. And to actually to force him is actually not allowing him to be the president of the United States.
At the point at which the administration began moving to withdraw from the INF treaty, much of the administration said the Russians violated the treaty, therefore we're shutting it, we're withdrawing. And Trump reiterated that, but Trump said, however, I think that we can develop a relationship with Russia on economic matters, trade matters, strategic matters, and so on, which will be unprecedented. So you have a schizophrenic administration here. The point for us, in light of what you're raising, the cybernetic question, I mean, this is a real danger. What do we do about it? We strengthen Trump's ability to engage with the four powers. And Trump's most important advances, as far as I'm concerned, have been in the international arena, where he's a little less controlled by this stuff than he is domestically with Russiagate. You want to pick up on that?
Well, just something because there's something that's being gotten at by the question, which is important for people to consider. Since 2006, there's been a crew in the United States, utopian military faction, which pushes a policy called prompt global strike, which believes that because the United States has advanced cyber warfare capability, that it would be possible to paralyze or neutralize the entire command and control structure of the Russian strategic rocket forces, at least in such a fashion that if you place certain kinds of cruise missiles and other things on their border, in places like the Baltic states, for example, that you could, in effect, freeze their capability to respond to a thermonuclear attack. Now, Putin has made it explicit, guys, that's over, and it's over in a way that you really don't want to try anything like that. That doesn't stop utopians, however, because they're crazy. If you don't have a such circumstance in which the President of the United States can freely discuss with his counterpart in Russia and deploy persons on each side freely because you have these investigations accusing people of working for the other government, you can create a circumstance in which precisely that kind of scenario could unravel. It may not seem to be likely, but it doesn't matter whether it's likely. It matters whether it happens. You know, everybody likes to talk at the point that these things occur about the fact that they shouldn't have occurred. That's one of the funnier parts of the movie Dr. Strangelove. That's one of the points of the movie. There's this constant discussion about, well, I thought that this couldn't occur. I thought I was the only person that had the right to. Yeah, and then there's always, right. And that's the point of it all. So what we're doing and what we're talking about doing with, for example, the article that Barbara wrote and the article that Benny and Johnson wrote, this is precisely the importance of getting that article circulated with respect to Mueller and with respect to the truth of the circumstance, because it's this that you're actually getting at by circulating the article. You're neutralizing this danger to the degree that this confrontation is forced by us with what people keep calling the deep state, but which we know as being the British imperial forces, including those that are fighting cyber warfare right now against the United States. Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hi, this is Jessica White from Brooklyn, and I want to thank Elliot for giving this presentation today. And I was able to actually break out of my house and get here, so that's another story. But I don't know how many people are aware that Walter Jones, the congressman from North Carolina, passed away recently. And when I read articles concerning his tenure in the House of Representatives, some people were saying things that weren't true about him. But one of the things that it brought up in my mind was our fight with getting Glass-Steagall on board in Congress. And he was one of the people who outwardly stated, openly stated, that he was sorry that he voted for the Iraq War when Baby Bush was president after 9/11. And it brought up in my mind also the connection between the economy, what's going on with President Trump, and how he stated in his, when he was running in his campaign, that he was for changing the economic outlook. Basically, he was for Glass-Steagall. And that's another thing that seems to have gone by the wayside in everything that they are doing against Trump. We see that the economy is worse than it was. He tries to paint a picture of better employment and things like that. But we know that there are things going on right here in New York that are absolutely outrageous as far as the economy is concerned. We have this congestion pricing thing that's about to hit. We have the problem with the student loans still. We have people still losing their homes. We still have the housing bubble is still a big problem. And I just wanted to kind of bring into play that this war danger is connected directly to this economic situation also. And that they do all, it's just deplorable, some of the sideways, some of the things that they do to the words of Trump. And believe me, my saying this is I don't even know the words to say, because I'm surrounded by hysterical people. You know, I'm surrounded by hysterical Democrats. I'm surrounded by hysterical people in my own family, where when I say this to them, when I say, look at the war danger, look at the economic picture, look at this trillions of dollars that we still owe, that we still are in debt to, look at how Obama was behaving with this, whatever they call it, what was it, I forget, quantitative easing. Okay, when I bring these things up, it's like I really have to go directly to LaRouche's information, directly to the 4 laws, which is actually a good thing because it kind of shuts them up and it makes them think. So I know other people are having this problem, but I know I'm having it right in my own family. Okay, hysterical. So I wanted to just bring back the idea of the connection between this war danger and the economic situation. And it brought it to mind when I read about the death of Walter Jones, when he was championing across the aisle getting Glass-Steagall passed.
Briefly, the British Empire put Hitler into power. That was their solution to the economic crisis, the 20s in Germany of the World Depression. That solution was British geopolitics, which led to a world war. They created fascism for that purpose. This is the physics of the matter, as I was referencing earlier. What does the American government do, among other governments, at the point that the derivatives bubble, the corporate debt bubble, and so on, the international financial crisis explodes, which is at any point? Well, the answer to that is we go to world war or genocide, or we have a leadership, U.S. and international, which has actually put forward Glass-Steagall, national banking, a credit system, massive infrastructure, a science driver, a new Bretton Woods. And that's the question of the development and strength of our leadership. Lynn has designed that. That's the only solution short of war and genocide under those conditions. So what do the hysterical people do under those conditions?
Hello, everybody. I'm Hyacinth Constance, and I'm from Brooklyn. And you'll find people from Brooklyn like to listen. We hear the political aspects, the scientific aspects, but we deal with the social things that touch us as life and living, I would say, as someone who says, what is life and what is it judged by what we do? And I feel that in the last statement that said about liberty and the freedom that we're being allowed, I feel those two issues mentioned in the same sentence with property is two different fields or two different things. Property to me is part of our economic situation. And perhaps property is always emphasized for someone like myself or communities who want shelter, whether it's provided government help or as we're in a capitalist society, you try and get your own property or your own housing, whatever. Now, what my bottom line is, how involved do I feel in all of this? Whether I focus on Trump, whether I focus on what he says and go into a panic and talk about the things that we did talk about, which was civil rights in the 60s. We talked about banning the bomb, nuclear. We talked about everything, and we understood it. What I'm saying now is, what is life to us, the person or the people who have children, and we see this conservation, certain programs that show for the seas, for things that are happening to the oceans. This is the stuff that you're surrounded with as a person, everyday life, everyday lifestyle. And we want people to say, hey, yes, you want to create economic situations for the country, for the West or the world. We want it under a grassroots system where the people are showing that we want it to be explained in a level of inclusion, shall I say. So that you're not saying, oh, we get property, this, and you're part of a system of socialism over here, capitalism over here. We want to show, or I would say, I want to show with my family, my children, generations to come, that there is a focus on those generations to come with some kind of concrete idea that there is betterment overall. Can't be for everyone, because I'm a Christian and it was already stated that not everyone can be rich or whatever. But there's a feeling that there is an inclusion, there's purpose, there's a social value in wherever you live. And that's the sort of things that should be discussed. How China's saying they're doing it, they're saying they're going over to Africa to include. America has, as much as they say, has never included Africa. Now they're saying they are. I don't know which parts and pieces that the music is going to get together or which notes are going to be played, but I think we should try and construct some kind of melody that melds. Thank you.
Well, this is useful. This is a very useful matter you bring up because it sort of is a way of embodying the problem of the American people at this stage. A lot of the problem, this was something that Lyndon LaRouche was acutely aware of because he understood that the boomer generation, of which I'm a member and others of us are members, had failed completely. And what had happened was that the United States no longer had a future as a result of the combination of failures of the boomer generation. Back in 2005, Lyndon LaRouche, after having worked to create a youth movement, published something which we put out at the time. I just happen to have the copy of it. It was a special Christmas edition. It was called LaRouche Dialogue with Youth, The Principle of Power. This is an 84-page magazine which has this article by Lynn LaRouche, and it's punctuated by 15 or 16 different offerings that were placed in the magazine by members of what was then the LaRouche Youth Movement. Different people did what he did was he produced a modern example of a Platonic dialogue. Now, it's important to understand why Plato wrote what he wrote. Plato wrote his dialogues as training manuals for a group of youth that were being recruited, of which he was one, by Socrates. When Socrates died, Plato was 28 years old. When he went into exile then into Egypt, to which he fled for 12 years, and then came back. And he began writing down the dialogues, the discussions that had happened, that had occurred with his teacher. The first of which was the Phaedo, which talked about how the study of philosophy, which was love of truth, was the study of how to die. And it starts with the death of Socrates. In this magazine that Lynn wrote, he had a very particular reference to what you're referring to, and it was the figure of Frederick Douglass, and I'll sign it here in just a minute, because he talked about Frederick Douglass and the importance of Frederick Douglass. As the celebrated freedom fighter of United States history, Frederick Douglass emphasized, freedom from slavery begins with the slave's freedom within his or her own mind, a freedom which is expressed only as the conscious development of the scientific and related creative powers of the sovereign individual mind. A slave or peasant, freed thus within himself or herself, cannot be kept in a state of servitude indefinitely. A freed slave who has not become free in his or her mind in this way will not be able to defend his or her freedom efficiently when that right is challenged afresh. As we have witnessed this fresh enshackling of the human mind by the lure of money, even within the United States itself, and notably among descendants of those whose ancestors had been enslaved increasingly during the most recent decades. I'll unpack that in just a minute. To reduce men and women to acceptance of some guise of servitude, it is sufficient to degrade their mental life to forms of cultural practices which imitate the brutes, as this was done to much of the post-World War II baby boomer generation by the satanic cults associated with the axiomatic bestiality of the existentialist and kindred sophist dogmas of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Now, that one paragraph does everything that you need to do to explain to people what their problem is and what they're going to have to do about their problem. Only if the slave frees his or her mind can the slave achieve freedom. And what Lynn refers to is that the lure of money has been increasingly used, particularly among the African American population, particularly in the last 3 to 4 decades to erode what had been the commitment of the civil rights movement, which no longer exists in the way in which it had existed before, either in the African American population or the American population in that way. The Trump administration, no matter what people would like to think, is fighting more seriously for freedom than anything that can be found presently in the black community, with the exception of the Nation of Islam in its earlier incarnation. Now, I've said it. Now, it's important to say this and why it's important. You know, we have this thing with the opioid epidemic, and I hear complaints that, okay, well, now everybody's concerned because we're talking about how many white people are dying. But actually, as many black people are dying of opioids as white people. So this is to show again that there's racism in the United States. See, now these kinds of things are supremely unuseful. These sorts of observations, whether true or false, are supremely unuseful. Because what they do is they avoid the fact that there is a conscious, willful, and deliberate policy to eliminate the American population, because there's a policy to eliminate 6 billion people on the planet. So that includes you. And what's being done is that the Green New Deal is being pushed as a way that people will call for their own elimination. That's what's happening. Then that's why you'll get Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez making a statement about how, oh, well, I guess maybe, you know, besides the fact that cows fart too much, we shouldn't have as many people, as she chops up whoever she's chopping up on her, you know, kitchen. So I mean, what is going on? No, you have to understand, it's not that it's embarrassing. No, there are people who actually agree with that. And what she's doing is she's recruiting those people, and she's saying out loud what they think. Here's how a fascist movement is put together. Now, does she know? She's not required to know. She's just required to do it. And so what you have, and by the way, her plan, the Green New Deal, is defended as being anti-racist because of the environmental racism and environmental degradation of poor neighborhoods, all that kind of stuff. But what's the issue here? This is just said as noise to distract from the truth. And that's why we are so important. See, Trump's challenge to the 16 intelligence agencies is a challenge to the banking system of the City of London and Wall Street. Now, his challenge should be more explicit. We would like that to be the case. We believe that there should be, obviously, this Four Powers Agreement. We believe there has to be a new Bretton Woods. We believe that there needs to be initiatives around Glass-Steagall. All those things are true. Yeah, but look at the presidency and look at what it's up against. Now, the issue is not to justify. The issue is, what are we supposed to do about that? We have a role to play. And what is happening is that people are apologizing for their cowardice by bringing up matters and issues that might have been valid 40 years ago in the way in which they're stating them, or 50 years ago. You know, you stated something about affirmative action back in the 1960s, that was valid. But, you know, America only gives you like about a decade. You know, the American people will give anybody a decade to solve a problem. You know, say, okay, fine, you say that's a problem. Let's give you guys 10 years. Oh, fine. It's 1965. Let's deal with affirmative action. 1975 comes around. People say, you want another 10 years for this? Okay, great. We'll give you another 10 years, and we'll work on this problem. But of course, you have to alter the fundamental institutions of government to deal with those problems, because there wasn't a problem of the type that affirmative action seemed to show. Then you get to the 1990s, and you're still saying the same thing. At this point, America has just switched off completely, okay? They're not hearing you any longer speaking about these kinds of matters. And what the problem was is that what people did not wish to face is that Lyndon LaRouche's economics, particularly as at that time he had the triple curve. It was 1995. Lyndon comes out with this. He explains, listen, here's what's happening, people. Unless we go back to productivity and away from speculation, this economy is doomed. If you play the game of keeping within the confines of how they define the matters of identity politics of any type now, then you will be a partner to your own self-destruction, whether you mean to be or not. And that's what's happening to people, particularly the boomer generation. The significance of what Lynn did with this was the principle of power. This is what the whole discussion with the youth movement was. How do you achieve power? It's not a matter of advocacy or asking for rights or, standing up against victimhood. It doesn't work. You have to come with an actual conception of how you think the society must be organized and why you are right. Why is it that your proposal increases the potential population of humanity as a whole, contributes to the increase of the higher living standard of that population? And why does that increase improve nature? How come everything? How do you create a situation where all things are better because of your economic proposal? This is what he challenged this young group of people to do, and he succeeded. This is back in 2004, 2005. There were various attempts to take it apart and so forth, but the reason I take this time to say this is because what the issue is that you cannot in any way formulate any solution to anything within the domain of the last half decade of American culture. There's any formulation you come up with will destroy you. You have to divest yourself of all of them. And so we use the chorus as the entry point for people because we know that the chorus is based on classical culture, which by definition has nothing to do with the last 50 years. By definition, what it does, it takes your entire mind out of anything dealing with now. It puts it in the mind of Mozart, of Beethoven, of Haydn, of Handel, of other musicians, including into the 19th century. But automatically, you don't even think, we don't even propose that you take anybody from the 20th century. We think it's a complete Holocaust culturally. So we don't even try to perform anything from there. We take a few of the things from the African-American spirituals, we take a few other things. We wouldn't be opposed to a few things, which are popular songs. It's not an issue. But the notion of music, because you referenced this, how do you end the cacophony that people are faced with? It's by starting with the chorus, starting with music, so you can cleanse out. Not by purgative violence, but by, in this case, a sense of harmony, return to the human mind. Because that's what Lynn was all about, and that's what he did with his Platonic dialogue with young people, which were not our generation. These were people much younger than we were, 30 years, 40 years younger. And he succeeded. And it's important just to say that because this, where we stand in America today with respect to what we're trying to do, this can be achieved, but we have got to break our own chains of slavery.
Amen. The final questions. Hello, gentlemen. My name is Donna Tarzia. I'm with Patrick Servideo from Connecticut. We're part of the LaRouche PAC Connecticut team. I'm proud to say that in a good way. My questions reference the article that Bill Binney and Larry Johnson prepared that you read to us. I was just wondering, has it been presented to President Trump? And if so, is the Trump administration doing something about it, or is it lying idle for the moment? And how do we shake up Congress, so to speak, to get their act together, to do the right thing, for the right reasons for the American people? That's it.
President Trump directed CIA Director Pompeo in October of 2017 to meet with Bill Binney. That meeting occurred late October of 2017. This was a couple of months after Binney and the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity initially put forward their evidence that there was no Russian hack. As best as I could see, Pompeo took in whatever, we don't know exactly what happened in that exchange or subsequent, but we know that the administration publicly did not act on what Binney and company put forward at that point. I would suggest when you look at Pompeo's role, this is the war party as it's unfolded. Now, the question is Trump the president or is the war party running the presidency? And what you have is a British, as the report from the British House of Lords, I referenced this a couple of hours ago, that the U.S. defense and intelligence establishment is very close to British intelligence. Historically, this goes back to the post-war period and the establishment of the special relationship and so on. And if you don't like that, they kill the president, etc. So this is, I mean, what Dennis went through is a crucial new development in this process that Binney and his team have now proven, beyond what they had said a year and a half ago, proven that there was no hack by the Russians or anybody else. This is only consistent with some kind of storage device. Well, that means that the original argument, just to restate, the original premise for Russiagate, for collusion between Trump and Russia, for Russian meddling, it's fake news. It always was. That this is now heavily reaffirmed and strengthened by the initiative which Binney took at our conference and which he's taken now. I think we did, is that up on the website? The interview yesterday that Jason did with him? You will see in the next days further material from Binney on this in concert with us. And we have, everyone in this room, this is the point of this question of leadership. Everyone in this room and everyone within this movement has to fight with our minds and their souls to reestablish a functional American presidency. LaRouche became a figure inside the presidency during the Carter period, during the Reagan period, and since, within the institution of the presidency. Because as you can see, presidents are surrounded by treason or cowardice, as in this case, and it is very much up to us to break the back of that and to create the condition for the American presidency to establish this four powers combination. That in turn uniquely can break the problems, economic and so on, in this country. So this is the I can't give you a full answer to your question. It's now unfolding. We will see what shall happen on this, as Trump says.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so we're at the conclusion of our meeting for today, so we want to thank everybody for joining us for it. We very much urge you to go to our website and begin the process of deploying around the initiatives that we have indicated, and there will be a lot more in the next week. We also have our conference calls and our organizing process, so if you're interested in working with us, just go to the website, and there's a page there for you to sign up and help organize. So on behalf of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, I want to end the meeting and thank everybody for being here.